Imagine you live at the turn of two giant periods of human history, at the end of the Old Age Antiquity and at the beginning of the Middle Ages. How would the Mediterranean world back then have looked to you? In what states were the cities in? And when was that even? When did antiquity actually end and the Middle Ages start? Can we even find such a date? And if yes, why? Questions over questions, so let's try to find answers. As regular viewers of this channel here have by now no doubt found out, the main period of time with which we are dealing here is the era of the late Roman Empire. Coincidentally, that period is also called Late Antiquity, the final stage of classical antiquity. The beginning of Late Antiquity is not perfectly defined, but normally it is placed around the year AD 300, or sometimes also with the beginning of the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, because it was a time of profound changes throughout the Roman Empire, and that date was 284 AD. Sometimes the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is also taken as the defining date of the start of Late Antiquity, because on that October day of the year 312, indeed the fate of the world was decided. So normally anywhere around that time, 300 AD plus minus, is usually the date when we would say that Late Antiquity had begun. But then when did it end? When did that final stage of antiquity end? When the old world would finally come to an end and the Middle Ages would start for real? As with the beginning of antiquity, precisely defining the ending date of antiquity is of course also not possible, but we would again have to probably give a range of years. Some say that antiquity ended with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but we know that this fall was a long dragged out one and nothing really impressive happened in 476 AD itself. The destruction of Italy in the Gothic Wars that raged from 536 to the late 550s certainly marked for Italy the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages, but not for the rest of the Mediterranean, so that also probably can't be it. But what was absolutely devastating for the Mediterranean was the Byzantine-Sasanian War from 602 to 628. That indeed was the war of all wars, an all-out war in which the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire were fighting on a scale never seen before. Many of the ancient cities and last remaining sites of antiquity were utterly destroyed or depopulated in that conflict, most often both, and only a decade after the conclusion of the war, out of nowhere, a new enemy arose and conquered large parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, thus ending the almost millennium of unity which the Mediterranean had seen up to this point. From that time onwards, the Mediterranean would never be the same again, being utterly separated in two completely different cultural and economic spheres of influence, the European one and the Islamic one, a divide which lasts even to this day. Therefore, the loss of vast territories for Eastern Rome, the destruction of many of the last great ancient cities, the fracturing of the Mediterranean in different cultural spheres, the reduction of trade, smaller economies, and also the beginning of the Byzantine Dark Ages, when the Eastern Roman Empire and even Constantinople shrank massively. That time is anywhere from the early to mid 600s. Those 50 years from 602 AD onwards, the outbreak of the Sasanian War to the loss of the great Eastern Roman provinces, those 50 years mark for me, and for most of the scholars, the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages in all parts of Europe. And if you are like me, a total Rome nerd, or Romaboo as some people like to say, and I think that you are, or else you probably wouldn't be watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can now even get a 20% rebate for every purchase. I repeat, a 20% price reduction for every purchase from the SPQR Shop, which is just an absolutely insane offer, and you can only get it here via the Maiorianus link, because let me tell you, the people from SPQR Shop also are absolute fans of the heroic Emperor Maiorian. So go and check out their incredible assortment. There will be certainly also something for you. So what would you have seen during those last years of late antiquity? Well, in 600 AD, everything would have still appeared quite nice. Nobody suspected what would be coming. In fact, the Roman Empire had seen a great revival and was still impressively large. The city of Constantinople was absolutely huge. Hundreds of thousands of people lived there. The great monuments of the classical Roman time were still mostly intact and well preserved. The aqueducts were in perfect working order. One could still even marvel at the old Capitolium of Constantine or the Temple of Helios in the Amastrianum. One could still see the great imperial fora in perfect condition in those times. In short, the city was still grandiose and prosperous. These were the last years in which Latin was still the official court language in Constantinople, and impressive chariot races were still held in the hippodrome, the same way they had been in the Roman Empire for more than 600 years by that time. But some other old great cities, such as Antioch, were already half-abandoned ruins by that time. A series of earthquakes and wars with Persia had destroyed that once old great city, and if you would have walked through Antioch in 600 AD, already by that time you would have seen desolation and decay and an utterly reduced population. Just 100 years earlier, the city would have still boasted 500,000 people, but in 600 AD, probably not even 10% of that number remained. This is similar to what you would have seen in that same year in Rome. Only 30,000 people lived there by that time, and the old great monuments of the Caesars had already begun to decay, with neither money, nor will, nor people to repair them. The Middle Ages had really begun in Italy. But in Carthage, meanwhile, in Africa, you would have not felt anything of Middle Ages. That city, which had been reconquered by the Romans under Belisarius in the year 533 AD, would still have seemed magnificent in 600 AD. Here, you would have thought that antiquity was still strong. The old round port was still in good condition. There were still chariot races in the hippodrome. Many of the old temples even were still standing, although of course converted either into churches or refitted for other purposes, such as warehouses. And even the old arena was still standing in those times, but of course had long ceased to be used for gladiatorial games, most likely since around the mid-5th century. It was now used as a storage space and sometimes as a meeting ground for political announcements. Unfortunately though, the old baths of Antoninus had also ceased working at some point in the 5th century, possibly damaged in the sack of Carthage of 439 by the Vandals. Then the last Vandal king Gelimer destroyed the aqueduct in 533 in the war against the Romans under Belisarius. And so by 600 AD there was neither fresh water for the old baths, nor were they ever restored. Instead, a ceramic workshop had been installed there, reusing old material from the baths for new building projects, such as churches, of which there were of course now many throughout the city. So even though Carthage had by 600 AD lost a lot of its ancient charm, some of the old buildings were still used, and it was still a fairly large city with probably over 100,000 inhabitants. But another city that in those times must have been more impressive than Carthage was Ephesus. By that time, this ancient Greek city had been a part of the Roman Empire for 730 years already. It was still impressively large. Hundreds of thousands of people lived there, and many of the old buildings of antiquity were still standing. Indeed, here in Ephesus, possibly more so than in Carthage in 600 AD, one would have had the impression that the Middle Ages were still far away. Now yes, some of the magnificent old buildings were no more. The Artemis Temple, one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world, had been severely damaged in a raid by the Goths in 268 AD and then possibly never fully restored, until it was then closed for good sometime in the 400s by fanatic Christians. Its stones were then at some point reused as building material, a fate that many buildings of the old world would suffer. Other buildings had been damaged as well in the Gothic attack of 268, such as the Library of Celsus, which by 600 AD had just been an empty husk with just the facade intact for over 300 years. And still, even so, the old harbor was still in use, the old amphitheater as well. However, not for theater plays anymore, but mostly for public announcements or for political gatherings. But many of the other old temples were still standing, and many new churches had been built under Justinian. The old colonnaded main street was still intact, and there must have still been bustling activity in those times. And as opposed to Carthage, the old baths of Constantine were still in working order. So you could in 600 AD still go to the baths in Ephesus, as opposed to Carthage or Rome. But all this was about to change drastically. In 614 or 615, large parts of the city were destroyed in the brutal Sasanian War, greatly reducing the population of the city. Around the same time, the port was disused because of silt built up from the nearby river, and in 654, the city was sacked by the Arabs, and so it had quickly lost its importance and much of the last semblance of the old world. By 700 AD, not much was left of the old glory. The Middle Ages had now indeed arrived even here. And these 100 years from 600 to 700 AD would see great transformations in many places. Another great city of the old world was Alexandria, which, similar to Ephesus, must still have been quite splendid in 600 AD. Sure, here too some of the old grandiose buildings of antiquity were no more. The Serapion had been destroyed by Christian fanatics in the late 300s, and the old library as well as the Museion had been damaged beyond repair and lay in ruin since the Roman civil wars of the 270s and 290s AD. Alexandria had ceased to be the center of knowledge and learning that it had been for over 500 years. However, the grandiose old lighthouse of Pharos was still standing incredibly by that time for almost 900 years. Alexandria fell in the early 640s to the Muslim Caliphate, and consequently then many of the old Roman-era buildings gradually fell into ruin and their building material was reused for the construction of other buildings. So here too, that time between 600 and 700 AD would again seem as the end of the old world, the end of antiquity. But even Constantinople would fall into ruin after the Avar siege of 626, when the aqueducts had been cut. And with the loss of the grain shipments from Egypt after the Arabs had conquered that province, the high population could not be sustained, and so Constantinople lost 80% of its inhabitants in the decades following that siege. Many parts of the city were deserted and started falling into ruin, and the people became utterly impoverished. It would take about 150 years until the recovery would slowly start. So we see no matter where we look, the 600s AD were the end of late antiquity, the end of the old world, and around 600 AD was probably the last time you would still have seen many of the great old Greco-Roman cities in splendid condition. Because only some decades later, the Middle Ages had really started. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please drop a like and consider supporting me on Patreon or via a YouTube membership. I would be super thankful. Thank you so much. And of course, please subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And I would of course like to thank everyone who is supporting Maiorianus in any form, be it through Patreon, YouTube membership, or via a PayPal donation. Thank you for supporting Maiorianus so that I can keep this a channel about late Roman history. And if you want to learn more about Alexandria, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about the other great cities of the late Roman Empire, you can watch the video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history. Gratias tibiago and bene valete.